At Caversham, near Reading, the BBC has been monitoring radio and television programmes from other broadcasters around the world for 60 years. But the monitoring service began its life deep in the heart of the English countryside in Worcestershire, in an eclectic array of buildings in the autumn of 1939, as World War II descended. For our archive hour now, Leslie Chamberlain tells the story of how the BBC listened to the war.
15 Uhr. Hier sind alle deutschen Sender. Angeschlossen sind die Sender des Generalgouvernements, Krakau, Warschau und Lemberg, sowie der deutsche Kurzwellensender mit Richtstrahler nach Ostasien.
It's Indian summer in the Vale of Evesham. We're looking out over mile after mile of apple trees and a serene, winding river Avon. I'm actually standing on a wooded hill which the BBC chose to be the home of one of its least known and most important sections, the monitoring service. The site was hastily chosen in the summer of 1939, when war with Germany seemed inevitable. Radio was a newish art and certainly a new political tool. The British government woke up when it realised the power of the anti-British propaganda which the Germans had been broadcasting. Its response, in tandem with the BBC, was twofold: to develop the work of its foreign language services, today's World Service, and what mattered even more in wartime, to listen to the domestic radio broadcasts of foreign countries. The monitoring service was designed to listen to both friendly and enemy radio, but its task became listening to the war. The monitors listened to what the Germans were telling their people. They used radio broadcasts to glean information and gauge public morale. From the moment the war began, in September 1939, in an Indian summer like this, they appear to have been extraordinarily successful. Whoever chose the site, Wood Norton Hall, was inspired. An unusual building was for sale, an extravagant Victorian pile with fleur-de-lis on every light switch and crowns on every stair-post. It had been done up by a man in search of a crown, the last pretender to the French throne, the Duc d'Orléans, in 1900. By 1939 he was elsewhere, and the BBC bought the house. I first became interested in the monitoring service because of the collection of mostly Jewish refugees whom the BBC found to staff it. These were men, and a few women, who managed to put aside their fears about loved ones left behind in occupied Europe to work in the English countryside to defeat Hitler. They were hugely talented people, poets, linguists, scholars, naturally more at home in the libraries and lecture theatres of Central Europe than the Worcestershire countryside. I've met half a dozen of them, and maybe the BBC sound archives can fill in some more gaps. They contain unforgettable evocations of a unique experience in British history. Some of the best material, the voices and memories of key players, was put together in a 1981 programme presented by a radio legend, Alvar Liddell.
Der Kampf Stalingrad ist zu Ende.
On Wednesday, the 3rd of February 1943, a special communique from Hitler's High Command was broadcast by the German Home Service. It caused widespread dismay among the civilian population of the Third Reich, but one listener for whom it was not intended, carefully transcribing the communique in a country house deep in rural Worcestershire, heard it with joy. The translation, which was soon on its way to London, was, however, strictly factual.
From the Führer's headquarters. The High Command of the Armed Forces announces, the struggle for Stalingrad has ended. Loyal to their oath to the last breath, the Sixth Army, under the exemplary leadership of Field Marshal Paulus, had to succumb to the numerical...
Combined with the British victory at El Alamein a few months before and the American landing in North Africa, the Russian triumph at Stalingrad seemed to make Germany's final defeat certain. But long before reporting that communique, the BBC monitoring service had established itself as an indispensable part of the nation's information-gathering machine. Every day, 500 employees were listening to and editing more than 1 million words in 30 languages. A brief but comprehensive roundup of the previous day's material was prepared every day, and a much fuller daily digest, often the length of a full-scale novel, was circulated to 600 recipients in government departments, allied embassies, newspapers, and, most important of all, the BBC's own news departments. Monitors, editors, reference librarians, and typists worked in shifts round the clock.
I was born in Russia, but actually I came to England as a refugee from Nazi Germany. And in the summer of 1939, to my surprise, I received a letter from the BBC asking me whether I should like to become a monitor. Then, fortunately, the letter went on to explain what a monitor was. It added, rather disconcertingly at the end, that the language for which I would be wanted would be Spanish. I had indicated Spanish on a BBC form, but I knew other languages better, let's put it that way, especially as I had taken my degree in Far Eastern languages.
Anatol Goldberg, a monitor and later a key commentator for the BBC's Russian service, was typical of the émigré intellectuals who found themselves here in the English countryside. Vova Rubinstein made his subsequent career in the monitoring service, as did Czech-born Ewald Orzers, who also found time to translate Czech and German literature into English. George, now Lord Weidenfeld, came to Evesham fresh from Vienna.
We had to assemble opposite Broadcasting House in what was known later as the Mayflower Bus. And there could have been no more than 25 or 26 people, I think. And I remember my poor father, who shared the secret. I told him that where I was going was hiding in the entrance of a door opposite, and sort of gave me this sign of benediction, because he had no idea where I might go. I'd go to Australia.
I reported as instructed to a particular ticket counter at Paddington Station and gave them my name, and he said, oh yes, somewhere in the country, that's Evesham. So I boarded the train, got out at Evesham, and there was a lady called Betty Buckle, the local billeting officer, waiting for me with a car, and drove me, I think, first to my billetor, a family of market gardeners, and then straight out to Wood Norton. The big house was occupied by some Latin American service of the BBC, part of the World Service, and the monitoring service was accommodated in Mrs. Smith's house. Nobody knew who Mrs. Smith was, but it was called Mrs. Smith's house, and it was a small two-story house, and the first person who received me was a few years younger than me and introduced himself as Storley Weidenfeld. Mm-hmm. And
Lord Weidenfeld.
Lord Weidenfeld now, first Sir George and then Lord Weidenfeld. He was wearing jodhpurs and looked very dashing. And he says, I'll take you to the boss. And the boss was Richard Marriott, who received me sitting on his desk, dangling his feet, which I thought was wonderful. I mean, no boss in a government or semi-government department in Czechoslovakia would have received a new staff member like that. Then he told me what it was all about, a sort of a 10-minute thumbnail sketch of the work.
There was little time to savour the novelty of the situation, for the monitors were plunged almost at once into the demanding daily routine, which was to continue for most of them for the next 6 years. David Byrne.
We set to work straight away. In fact, the moment we arrived, we started recording our bulletins, listening to them. I mean, as soon as war broke out, Germany became our priority, and we covered it round the clock, Berlin and the regional stations as well.
Hier spricht der Sender Wehrwolf, Sender der deutschen Freiheitsbewegung in den vom Feind besetzten Gebieten.
The recordings on wax cylinders were made at the top of the hill by a small team of engineers and brought down in wicker baskets by elderly men known as boys, in the newspaper tradition. And of course, when it rained or after it rained, the slopes were muddy and the wax cylinders frequently arrived cracked or broken, sometimes quite shattered. And we were enjoined not to rely on the cylinders, but to get as much down as possible.
And what about the quality of the broadcast? I've listened to some recordings of recordings, as it were, and they're terribly crackly. And
the technical quality, you mean? Yes.
I can't imagine how you made out these important messages. I can hardly make out a word.
My worst experience of that was the Prague Rising, a few days before the end of the war. The rebels, if you like, had captured the lesser transmitter, Prague 2, which was very weak. And a colleague of mine, George Langweil, and I covered it. And there was an agonizing half hour when they called for Allied help because German tanks were advancing along the so-and-so road. And we couldn't make out what road it was. We tried all the tricks we knew, running it fast, running it slow, loud and soft. In the end, George Langweil could make out that it was the Benešov road. So we rushed to the news bureau, and within a minute or so, they were through to the Air Ministry and to the command of the Free Czech Air Force. And it was all in vain, because I said, sadly, we can't intervene. It was agreed in Yalta that the liberation of Czechoslovakia is to be done by the Soviet Union.
Da ist wieder. Der Kohlenklau geht
I remember one day in Evesham, they had requested we should monitor Ruthenian. So the word got round and said, now who knows Ruthenian? Nobody knew Ruthenian, absolutely no idea. Well, I said, in that case, you've got to take somebody who knows the language which is similar to it and just do your best. That was me.
Is it similar to Russian?
Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Russian, sort of that kind of thing. When the broadcast started, I suddenly realized that actually I had been listening broadcasts in Ruthenian, because in the last few days before I took my test, when I was still in Cambridge, I only had a very, very old shaky receiver, and I said I really must listen to some Russian broadcasts just to familiarize myself with new terminology and all that. And finally, with this old receiver, I picked up a broadcast from Budapest, which to my ears was terribly distorted Russian, completely mispronounced and, and altogether not really very professional. Now, when I got this broadcast, the first broadcast was Budapest and Ruthenian. That, to my great joy, was my old friend from Cambridge. After which I was declared to be definitely the Ruthenian monitor.
One of the earliest duties of the German monitors, who were mainly refugees from the Nazis, was to record and translate the speech in which Hitler celebrated his conquest of Poland.
2 Tagen sind unsere Städte, Märkte und Dörfer geschmückt mit den Fahnen und Symbolen des neuen Reichs. Unter Glockenläuten feiert das deutsche Volk einen großen, in seiner Art geschichtlich einmaligen Sieg.
The German nation is today celebrating a victory unique in history. A country which had a population of 36 million and an army of roughly 50 divisions opposed us. A week after the struggle had begun, the die had already been cast. Wherever Polish troops encountered German detachments, they were repelled.
Any broadcast by Hitler was a major event. Another broadcaster from Germany made daily appearances on the air.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reichssender Hamburg, Station Bremen, and Station DXB on the 31-meter band. You are about to hear our news in English. The New York Times reports the British cruiser Exeter has been run
yes.
aground.
Oh, was an institution. It took 2 of us to do him every night, 22:30.
More interesting for Lorna Squire and her colleagues were the so-called black stations operated by Germany but claiming to be manned by dissident Britons. On the 5th of March 1940, while winter and the phony war still lay upon Europe like a blight,
this is the new British broadcasting station, operating on 5,925 kilocycles and on a wavelength of 50.63 meters. Have you ever given any thought to the fate of your children? I mean, those who are old enough to have some idea of what is happening, but not old enough for military service. Do you realize that the government's evacuation plans, or should one say their complete collapse, may have a profound effect upon your boys and girls in years to come? Do you remember how in the month before last...
Other black stations were even less convincing. Workers' Challenge was one, full of crude language, and Radio Caledonia. Speculating about the identity or appearance of freedom broadcasters provided the monitors with a little light relief. Ray Barker, who had joined the BBC from the Ministry of Pensions, was another English-language monitor.
We used to listen to these bulletins, and we used to make mental pictures among ourselves of what they were like. There was one station, I think it called itself Christian Peace, and we imagined an unfrocked priest with soup stains all down his lapels, and long hair.
Golly, this is where it happened then. It's rather like the hut where I used to go to Girl Guides about 40 years ago. In a pretty bad state, I would say, full of cobwebs, no doubt a few spiders, and 4 layers of flaking green paint. I think it's the paint that's holding the building together. But what did it look like then? Well, quite different in a way, I suppose. I've got a photograph here from the BBC Quarterly of 1947 of the room as it was actually used by the monitors. It looks a bit like a wireless repair shop, lots of wires and dials and switches lying around. Kitchen tables and chairs with big boxy wirelesses on them, 3 to each table. Filing cabinets, waste paper baskets, a sort of bit like a schoolroom in a way. But obviously someone's gone to the trouble to make it a nice place to work, because it has curtains and little pelmets to match, and I think that once the monitors settled down, they probably had a rather good social life. The Russians were particularly good at having sing-songs, and there were parties, picnics by the Avon, and Ewald Orzers even found time to have a game of table tennis while listening to German radio.
That was at Christmas, when Richard Marriott decided that it would be enough to leave the German coverage to 2, by then reasonably experienced monitors. Otto Giles was one of them and I was the other. And he came with a pair of headphones with something like a 10-meter line to them, so that we could be plugged in upstairs and play table tennis downstairs. And if anything happened, we would just rush upstairs and take down the bulletin.
Social life was very lively, and to me certainly it was also new, because it was sort of introduction not only to adult life as well as to English life, although it was a very cosmopolitan life too. On the one hand you had the most diverse people, diverse nationalities. On the other hand you also have every sort of type of English or Scottish or Welsh man and woman. You could imagine, you had people who were the retired businessmen or were in the export-import business, that's why the vocal language. You had different levels of intelligence. You had academics, you had the schoolmaster, you had journalists, of course, quite a few. Funny enough, journalists were not a preferred category because they were always suspected of being inaccurate.
Because of the shift patterns, we used to ride round to the local pubs in groups of anything between 8 and 12 or more. And we cycled over to Broadway, which is only a few miles away, because somebody had discovered that, obviously through a loop in the rationing regulations, a loophole, one firm, small place there, was making fudge. I mean, chocolate was strictly rationed, but somehow fudge had escaped the regulations. And we used to cycle over there and stock up with fudge.
It was a rather rural, not to say bucolic place, and they reacted to the presence of this slightly eccentric gang of lunatics from all corners of the world with unmitigated suspicion. Stories would be repeated to me by my quite benevolent and friendly landlady about orgies in the air raid shelters up in Wood Norton, and wild parties, and terribly improper hours kept by all these bohemian foreigners. The point being, of course, that we worked round the clock, 24-hour shifts, and we would come rolling in on our bicycles from work at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the locals were quite convinced that their billetees, we were called, must have been up to some sort of mischief. Otherwise, like respectable people, they would have gone to bed at 9 and been up at 4:30 to milk the cows.
I must admit, some very exotic types turned up. And at first there was a bit of a xenophobic reaction. But then when the time came for us to go, I remember we went in batches on the train, and I was standing on the bridge at Evesham, the railway bridge, watching an extraordinary batch going. You see, there was one old German who did Turkish, and he had a kind of fur balaclava helmet on, and there was another woman carrying a bird cage, and there was another man with a wild fur coat and correspondent shoes. Well, anyway, a very exotic-looking bunch, and somebody came up near me and said, "Oh, I am sorry you're going. It livened up the place a bit."
I've come to the BBC written archives in Caversham, where room upon room of files of material from the war is still kept. We've just been presented here with a trolley of what looks like 30 or 40 files. I don't know how we're going to get through it. There's a great deal of stuff about furniture and the inadequacies of the lavatories at Wood Norton, and the urgent need to expedite the improvement of this facility, which I think we can all sympathise with. And there's quite a lot also about the billets in which the staff lived. One of the most controversial aspects of life in the billet was that beds had to be shared. In fact, beds had to be shared with complete strangers, and so there's a certain number of memos here about who's going to change the sheets, then what is to become of the inadequate stock of BBC linen. Apparently people got used to sharing beds with strangers. I don't think I could, but, well, in wartime you can get used to anything. The people of Evesham were rather surprised to find these foreigners suddenly descending on them. Evesham was a very quiet place then, the Midlands capital of market gardening, and they had a special word for foreigners, I think something like foreigner. It's a foreigner. Another problem was actually getting out to Wood Norton. It's about 3 miles outside of Evesham, and I suppose the roads were smaller. Many of the monitors cycled. 1 or 2 turned up on horses. That was not encouraged. It was somewhat problematic. They tethered them to the Duke d'Orléans' beautiful wrought iron gates. Those who came on bicycles found it very, very cold, especially at midnight in what were some of the worst winters of the 20th century, I think.
At one time, the BBC would not allow women to wear trousers. I have to remember that under Lord Reith, before the war, even the radio, then wireless announcers, had to wear dinner jackets in the evening when reading the news. Whether anybody saw them or not, the gentleman just wore a dinner jacket in the evening. And certainly no women were ever allowed to work in the evening or at night. Obviously, the monitoring service needed typists at night. So the personnel officer, who was clearly in sympathy with the girls' wish to wear trousers at night, eventually got the management to agree to that. I mean, when you come to think of it, I mean, trousers were really more moral than skirts at night. But
it's certainly better on a bicycle at midnight.
Exactly, but I suppose then a lady didn't wear trousers except for skiing or riding. And anyway, so an edict came out that after office hours and at night on night shift, the female staff could wear trousers so long as these were of dark colors, black, navy blue, or dark bottle green or something like that.
There's a record here of the fire. I didn't know what day it happened. I'd read about it in other sources. It happened on the 4th of September 1940. And suddenly the whole top floor and roof of the building in Wood Norton was on fire. There was a great deal of fuss. Partly, I think, the fire brigade was called. It had been a very dry summer, and so they couldn't fill their hoses from the hydrants. They had to fill them from the river Avon, which is actually quite a distance from the house. So they did this. They put it out quite quickly. There were a lot of volunteers who got the BBC equipment out, the audio equipment. I don't think too much was lost, but in fact the whole of the roof was irreparably damaged and the top floor of the building. And it wasn't sure at the time what had started the fire, and there was a worry that either it was sabotage or it was also a signal to the Germans, and so the RAF were patrolling overhead to intercept any German planes that might pick up the site of the fire and use it to bomb Wood Norton. It turned out actually that it was an accident. They never really knew what caused the fire. And if you go to the house today, you can still see the wood panelling which runs throughout this house. You can see the black marks where the fire penetrated to the lower floors. Mr. Smith writes that I was enjoying a rare day off, and on the road between Evesham and Wood Norton I saw the smoke and hurried to the scene. Now, between Evesham and Wood Norton was a large house called Abbey Manor, owned by Squire Rudd, who had a hobby of firefighting. That's very convenient. He owned an old London fire brigade, solid tired fire engine, full uniforms with brass helmets for his staff and a silver helmet for himself. He had a private telephone line to the local telephone exchange and would be informed of any rick fire in the district, whereupon he and his male staff would set off in the fire engine, driven by his chauffeur. The BBC had taken over the house to provide studios for the use of the Overseas Empire news services, leaving only the chauffeur of the Squire's staff in residence. On my arrival at Wood Norton, it appeared that the fire hydrants and hoses in the building were fed from a small pond halfway up the hill, which had quickly been used up, and the Evesham firefighting equipment in attendance consisted only of a taxi towing a small trailer pump. This was a wartime arrangement provided in many small towns during the war, and not of much use in fighting the Wood Norton blaze. I immediately went back to Abbey Manor and found the chauffeur anxiously waiting to know if his fire engine could be of use. We quickly took it out, and with me ringing the bell on the engine, drove to Wood Norton. He took the engine across the fields to the river for a supply of water, whilst I ran the hoses out up the drive from the Golden Gates. Being used to the location of rick fires away from a supply of water, there were ample lengths of hose, and we soon had a better squirt than the Evesham firefighters. Soon firefighting equipment appeared from Pershore and Worcester, enabling the blaze to be got under control by about 1 a.m. the next morning. We were, of course, very worried lest the fire should attract German bombers known to be in the vicinity, and great efforts were made by all staff to rescue technical equipment, records, office furniture, filing cabinets, typewriters, and so on, all of which would have been very difficult to replace in wartime. It was quite understandable in these circumstances that in their efforts to save a grand piano, staff not normally associated with orchestral activities should have sawn off the legs of the piano to get it out through a doorway, not aware that the top was made to lift off the leg framework for normal transportation. Geoffrey Grigson, English poet and man of letters, was a supervisor here, responsible for improving the English of the foreign monitors. Talking to Roy Plumley on Desert Island Discs in 1982, he wasn't sure it had all been worth the effort.
Peter Pears singing one of the Haydn 6 canzonets, She Never Told Her Love. So the war started. You joined the BBC, Geoffrey?
Yes, I joined the BBC in that strange thing called the monitoring service.
Was this up at Evesham?
Up at Evesham, which left a very curious trail behind it, the monitoring service at Evesham, I think.
Yes, it was christened Babeltown. You were a very cosmopolitan community.
A very cosmopolitan community,
What
yes.
we were doing?
Oh, editing enemy broadcasts into a vast, useless, Roneo-typed report that ostensibly went up to the cabinet. It certainly left Evesham. What happened to it afterwards? I don't think anybody ever looked at it.
This was a translation job, was it?
It was editing, translation, so on and so forth, yes.
Was this in the ducal mansion?
That was in the ducal mansion, where it is the only place where I've ever taken one end of a cross-cut saw to saw the leg off a grand piano. That was my great experience at Evesham, really, because the ducal mansion caught fire.
And why was it necessary to saw the leg?
Because you couldn't get the grand piano out through the window or the door.
Oh, I see, a salvage job. Well done.
Salvage job. Then the fire was stopped, and the grand piano was left with only 2 legs.
Yeah, so there was a fleur-de-lis on
yes,
every door, wasn't
everywhere.
there?
Yes, yes. The French Pretender's house.
Were you able to do any writing for yourself?
Oh, yes, a bit.
In due course, you escaped from the monitoring service, but remained within the BBC. Where did you go?
I went to Bristol. And that was very pleasant indeed, I must say.
To do what?
As a talks producer. Yes, that was all right. One had a kind of kingdom which stretched from Southampton or thereabouts to Land's End.
There's a report here of a broadcast on how women should behave in wartime in Germany. And the broadcast said, "We women should not be bound by habit. We must learn how to do things in a different manner. The housewife must know how to help herself when the butcher cannot supply her with pork or the grocer with sauerkraut. Such things are not tragic. The wife must show her true comradeship with her husband in the forces by not writing to him of her small daily worries, that shopping takes so much longer and is so much more difficult, and that her supper is occasionally interrupted by a promenade to the basement. Hardest of all for the women is the waiting, the anxiety for their husbands, but the courage required of them should make women proud." I think what the monitors were listening for, and I think often they only had a very vague idea, they were trying to put together an idea of the state of agriculture, the state of food supplies, the weather. What they wanted was an idea of German morale, the morale of the civilian population, and this then could be fed through to other bureaus, and particularly I think the stations that were broadcasting back into Germany in German to try to break German morale. So it was very important that they were given accurate information about how things were in Germany, and they could then play on that and try to make things worse. The public is asked to treat banknotes with care. Economy is necessary with household fuel. And a new lotion has been invented to give typewriter ribbons a longer life. So the monitors are listening in very closely to every detail of German domestic life, which must have given them a very strong feel for what life was like there.
Farmers' talks were considered very important, almost more important than news bulletins, because they might provide clues to crop failures, harvest expectations, and so on, and indirect clues to the weather.
Mm-hmm. So you're listening to the Nazi equivalent of farming for today?
Probably, yes. And on one day, to my horror, from Hamburg, I had a talk on bulls servicing cows in wartime and how valuable bulls' semen was, not a drop was to be wasted. And it went on into details. And I was totally out of my depth. I mean, my sexual vocabulary was based more on what you could read on the walls of public lavatories than on scientific animal biology. But when I explained my predicament to my typist, she said, "Don't worry, I'm a farmer's daughter. You will just use the words you know, and I'll put it into proper English." And she did, and there was no embarrassment on either side.
This is from a brief account of Wood Norton and its activities by W.B. Purslow, who I think was an engineer and very much a founding presence in Wood Norton. He's talking about the precautions for air raids. An air raid warning system was installed by placing loudspeakers in positions to cover the outside premises as well as the main house. The warning was the teddy bear's picnic. This was chosen because it was a well-known air, due to it being the test record to prove the reproducing equipment and studios were in perfect order before a broadcast. On September the 3rd, 1939, the Prime Minister announced, through the medium of sound radio, that Britain was at war with Germany. Immediately after, the sirens sounded all over the United Kingdom, and the teddy bear's picnic sounded over Wood Norton. The staff carried out their instructions perfectly and took shelter in the woods. Unfortunately, by an oversight, I had not established an all-clear tune, and this, I'm sure, was much appreciated by the younger members of both sexes.
the long, legendary year during which Great Britain lacked an active ally anywhere in the world, while everywhere Germany was triumphant or conspiring against her, ended dramatically.
Говорит Москва. С рассветом 22 июня 1941 года регулярные войска
This is Moscow,
германской армии
the 22nd of June 1941. At dawn, the German armies fell upon our country from the Baltic to the Black Sea, without a declaration of war.
There was a sudden demand for Russian monitors. Vova Rubinstein, selected as a German speaker, now had reason to feel grateful for the years he had spent in Russia.
I happened to monitor the first wartime Stalin speech after the attack. Well, I must say that I was really a little bit overawed by this unexpected event. I knew that everybody would want to know every word that Stalin said. So I proceeded to listen. Now, the dreadful thing was that obviously he was broadcasting from some sort of studio which had been arranged or moved, possibly underground. The acoustics were absolutely terrible. I mean, add to that his Georgian accent, and most of the words were really quite incomprehensible. The only thing that was completely clear was the bubbling noise of water, which he was drinking from time to time. Obviously, what everybody wanted to know was whether the Russians were going to give in, whether they were going to conclude peace, whether they were going to fight on. And I simply could not extract information from that speech, because practically all the words were terribly blurred. Well, towards the end, I could at least say that the speech, the second part of the speech, certainly contained an appeal to fight on. And that, of course, was very encouraging.
I have the impression that we're dealing, in a way, with a more, perhaps necessarily, with a more naive world than the one we now live in, where we take it for granted that the other side is, to some extent, lying. I don't think the people who were working in the first monitoring service did assume that. I think they thought the Germans were lying. I didn't think they thought their own side lied. Perhaps that was a slight oversight. Or if they did think they lied, they thought it was in a good cause. Perhaps it was. It's just become very difficult to believe that kind of thing now. The conviction that the war was the right thing and that it was a war against the forces of evil was absolute. Nobody questioned it. And therefore that helped the monitors to work really against, in the beginning, against waves of bad news all through 1940. And also helped them to overcome rather difficult conditions in their billets due to the fact that they were refugees, and I think many of them must have felt very unhappy about being parted from their families. Many of them didn't know what had happened to their families, and I think were right to fear the worst. I mean, these were nearly all Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia, Hungary.
I'd always been brought up with the idea that the only stiff upper lips you ever met were in Britain, but this is not true, because everybody had the stiffest of upper lips. And yet they knew, well, in lots of cases they didn't know where their families were, and they suspected, quite rightly, that most of them were in camps. After the war, of course, when they found out where they'd gone to, it was really quite dreadful. Some of them had lost every single relation they had, and they must have been in a terrible state. But they never showed it, except one Dutch girl. I remember she ran out of the listening room sobbing because Rotterdam was being bombed and one thing and another, and she couldn't bear it because she'd lived there. But I never saw anybody else show any emotion at any time.
I just wonder about your own emotions. I mean, many of you you were refugees.
Yes, I mean, we were all
behind.
worried about our families in Hitler-occupied Europe, obviously. And it may well be that our endeavors to be cheerful and have fun may have been a sort of reaction or an attempt to suppress these anxieties. But this may be an ex post interpretation, I don't know.
He thought it's very important that the powers that be should know about what was in the Nazis' mind, that sometimes we felt certain things might have been overlooked, or we felt that we could predict trends so that we could give them insights that they were not aware of. We had this feeling, and we were, you know how it is, in particular in the intelligence world, when you were never told what you did or what you're not thanked for anything particular, but there was a whole sense of being appreciated, and they did it very well. You were not left in doubt that it was important war work, yes.
To my mind today, looking back at Wood Norton and talking to you and other monitors who were there at the time, you were much more like a community of scholars than a community of journalists, as we know now.
This is how I felt. You see, during the monitoring years, I've always had in my mind, and most of the other people too, that we are creating archives, actually, as it happens. Historical archives, and also during the war, I mean, I wanted to leave a record of what was going on, and that had to be accurate. They may have been disagreeable, or it may be boring, but archives, I mean, have to be accurate, and archives, we thought, for the sake of history, really, were very, very important.
Flugblätter des Gegners wandern heute nicht mehr wie 1918 von Hand zu Hand, sondern begegnen allgemeiner Verachtung. Auf wen setzt der Feind eigentlich seine Hoffnungen, wenn einen neuen 9. November erwartet? Wir wissen, dass wir mit alledem für das deutsche Volk nur Binsenwahrheiten aussprechen.
The monitoring service had really been born and had certainly grown to maturity at Evesham, and there to most of its members it seemed to belong. The BBC had decided, however, that it should be moved to Caversham on the outskirts of Reading, partly for technical reasons, but mainly to leave Wood Norton free to become the BBC's emergency headquarters if it had to move from London. In the end, after 18 months of argument and delay, the great move was accomplished in April 1943 without a single day's monitoring being lost. Before that, however, there had been an epic row, for the three senior officials in charge at Evesham, supported by most of their staff, were bitterly opposed to leaving it. The most senior of them, Richard Marriott, then head of the monitoring service, was convinced that the quality of its work would suffer.
What appeared to be going to happen was when we moved to Caversham, the engineers were not going to be in the same building as the rest of the monitoring service. They were going to be in a house nearby, which was bought at the same time, which was in the centre of the grounds. We were going to go back 2 or 3 years and going to have engineers working to an engineering schedule and sending down to Caversham to these people who would translate obligingly whatever was sent to them. And this was something that both the two heads of the actual reception services and I were totally and absolutely against.
Besides the fear that the monitors themselves might no longer be really in charge, was another equally creditable personal motive.
We were all young men and we were all fit and capable of fighting, and we all, in a sense, felt, I think, a pull away from this. If there was something you could disagree about and strike a blow for the change that you felt was right, at the same time get out and do your part in the war, it would be a good thing, I think.
Eventually, when their protests proved unavailing, the three rebels resigned and joined the forces, where one was to lose his life. Ironically, once the service was re-established at Caversham under new leadership, the rebels' chief demand was conceded.
They did go, and they changed it, and when they got there, they changed it back to the sensible system and worked on that when they got there.
The general public remained unaware of these stirring events, and Richard Marriott now handsomely admits that perhaps the whole hard-fought controversy was unnecessary.
We thought we were right. Perhaps we were wrong.
Along with the main group of monitors, or M section, the mysteriously named Y unit also moved to Caversham. It was here that Martin Sullivan, who had answered an advertisement for Polish monitors while working for a firm of dry cleaners, joined it and learned for the first time the nature of his new and very different job.
M unit took in the news. They monitored for content. Y unit, as such, monitored for behavior or for intelligence. They took things like prisoner of war messages, and they watched the behavior of stations to see if they departed from schedule in any way, if there was anything abnormal about it, if there were certain tunes played. I mean, things had meanings, and the monitor was not always aware of these, but they had instructions to listen and look out for certain things.
If the Germans played any song with the name of Peter in it,
and we had a little short list of songs with appropriate titles such as Peterle, Mein kleines Peterle. We were immediately supposed to telephone the Air Ministry or the Admiralty.
A lot of the items we monitored, bulletins, were in code, so we didn't really know what use they were being, except I remember being told afterwards when we'd monitored a sort of variety programme that they traced the course of a submarine all the way over the Atlantic by this bulletin. So, you felt you were doing something that might be of use.
And it was a very mysterious assignment, which I used to do, I believe, on Thursday afternoon at 1600 hours. You sat yourself down in front of a set on which an Italian station on the 48-meter band or thereabouts had to be tuned in. And at that hour, it played an hour of solid, unannounced martial music in the best fascist Mussolini style. It sort of went oompa, oompa, oompa. When you were seated there, the supervisor came and gave you a very grubby envelope, sealed with brown paper tape. You were supposed to undo it in his presence and read this very worn BBC memorandum, which had been folded so many times that it was virtually falling apart. And on this memorandum it said that if they should play the Inno dei Sommergibilisti, which being translated vaguely means the anthem of the submariners, you were to again ring the Admiralty on a certain number. Every Thursday I would go through the same little routine of saying to the supervisor, right, how does it go? And every Thursday I had the same reply, well, that's just a little difficulty, old boy. Nobody knows how it goes. I spent years listening for this elusive tune, and I never did hear it to my knowledge.
Even the man in charge of M Unit, Oliver Whitley, said that he, as far as Y Unit was concerned, he simply didn't ask questions. He knew what was good for him. And that's another thing that's very striking in this time of monitoring, that people didn't feel they were entitled to know everything. They accepted that secrecy was necessary in wartime. There's an account by Sir Ernst, or later Sir Ernst Gombrich, the art historian, who was a brilliant monitor and supervisor. And he said, I think very, very modestly, he said he would have liked to have known more about the purpose of his work, but he understood that the war was on and secrets had to be kept. So he worked on, as I think they all did, a little bit blindly and in good faith. They took down everything they heard and tried to pass it on. And in fact, Gombrich had a good example of where it would have been more helpful if they'd been given more background information, because they were monitoring broadcasts from Germany in which the Germans were talking about developments in physics and talking about the atom. And the monitors didn't see the significance of this. Even Gombrich himself didn't see the significance. But it was, in fact, the early signs of a development of a German atomic program, and it was that which absolutely frightened the government in London, and they feared that the Germans would be able to use what we would now call weapons of mass destruction on London. And that came quite early on in the war and seemed to be a very negative sign indeed. And if the monitors had known about that, they could have concentrated on it more thoroughly.
About the value of one task performed by the monitoring service throughout the war, there could be no doubt.
And before we conclude this program, here are some messages from British prisoners of war to their next of kin. The first one is from Private Thomas Smart, 293-2886. It's addressed to Mrs. T. Smart, 182 Overton Road, Kirkcaldy, Caversham, Scotland. Dear Cathy, I was captured by the Germans and am now in Germany and am well, so do not worry.
One woman would be what was known as the prisoner queen for the day, and she would retire to a cubicle armed with a gazette, an atlas, and a directory of streets, because you had to get everything absolutely right. And she would then transcribe these prisoners' messages. And then by the time she'd finished, which mostly took her about 4 or 5 hours, she would go out and look for somebody else to check it. I remember one time a man sent his love to a girl, and 3 of us heard that, 3 entirely different names. And we were so terrified because we thought it might put the cat among the pigeons, if he sent love to the wrong girl.
On the 29th of April 1945 came the news of Mussolini's execution by Italian partisans. News of another death was even more eagerly awaited by the monitors.
My wife often asked me, why do you go? You don't feel well. And I said, well, you never know. Maybe Hitler is dead, you know.
And then at last, as Sir Ernst Gombrich recalls,
there was a long sequence of standbys for an important announcement. Then there was a long broadcast of the slow movement of a Bruckner symphony in memory of the death of Wagner. And I reported that as pretty significant. And I wrote out, prior to the announcement, 2 or 3 options, one of them Hitler dead. And when the announcement came, I appointed, was telephoned to Downing Street. So in that sense, I brought the news.
One of the German monitors on duty on the afternoon of May the 7th, 1945, was Susan Temple.
There was only one transmitter left, one certainly in Flensburg, and we watched it literally every second of the day. And on that particular day, on the 7th of May, there were 4 of us watching Flensburg. And suddenly I heard it come up, you know, that unmistakable hum that means that the station is coming up. And of course it was immensely exciting, and I shouted, and everybody switched over to that wavelength. And it was Schwerin von Krosigk saying, "Ich habe allen deutschen Truppen befohlen, die Waffen niederzulegen," meaning that all the troops had been ordered to lay down arms. And of course that was the word we were waiting for, all. And after about one sentence, I rushed off to transcribe it, and then the others took over, and the next person did a sentence, and that's how we got it out.
Even in the moment of victory, the monitoring service did not relax its tradition of scrupulous accuracy. On the following morning, while the rest of the country was celebrating VE Day, Anatole Goldberg, who 6 years before had been one of the Mayflower bus pioneers, was still very much on duty.
I remember going there in the morning, and when I arrived I was told it's over. I listened to the record. It was translated. It was sent to the editorial department. Then I discovered that there had been a typing slip. And I went up, and they said to me, too late, it has been typed and rolled off. So I said, look, this is the end of the Second World War in Europe. We can't leave that translation of that speech in an imperfect state. What will history say? Well, that impressed the editor very much, and although he had strict instructions to economize paper, he did destroy the copies, and it was typed again.
When the camps were liberated, lists of prisoners who had survived were broadcast, day in, day out. The monitoring service could not spare people officially to listen to all these, but there were volunteers who decided they must listen to these reports and, if possible, pass on the news. And there was one of my colleagues who, in volunteering for this work, heard that his sister was alive, and that's an unforgettable moment.
What impresses me about the Wood Norton story is how long ago it seems to have happened in ideological history. The age was still naive. It was still possible to believe straightforwardly in who was right and who was wrong, in good and evil. BBC monitoring in Caversham, 60 years old this year, is now a huge technological concern, monitoring the radio stations of the world in 100 languages and watching scores of TV screens. The Wood Norton ethos, however, the world of values that lived in these wooden huts, in the minds of George Weidenfeld, Stephen Seger, Ewald Osers and Wovo Rubinstein, Ernst Gombrich, Lorna Swire and Susan Temple, risks fading into oblivion. The absence of any commemoration of the past here, at what today is a BBC training centre, leaves the feeling of an opportunity missed.
It was a strange way to fight a war, eavesdropping on the enemy, listening to lies, sometimes to the truth, an occupation at once solitary and gregarious. To enliven their off-duty hours in exile at Caversham, some monitors had written a review, which after the war was performed in London, though for one night only. Monitors like Lorna Swire and Susan Temple, who had spent the war listening to others, were at last able to move into the limelight.
I spend a lifetime listening. Commentators come and go. I'm rather in a fog as to why I keep a log, but someone always wants to know. Every word that's spoken, every tune a station played, I must keep my wits about me, but it's happened, I'm afraid. I fell in love with a voice, I couldn't help it, you needn't scoff. I get the best of him. As for the rest of him, do you never wish